The Further Adventures of Romney Pringle. Story number 2. The Submarine Boat by Clifford Ashdown. Trick, track, trick, track went the black and white discs as the players moved them over the backgammon board with expressive justification of the French term for the game, trick-track. They were indeed a nation of poets, reflected Mr. Pringle. Was not trick toof toof for the motor car an veritable inspiration? And as he smoked, the not unmusical clatter of the enormous wooden discs filled the atmosphere. In these days of cookery, not entirely based on airtights, to use the American expressionism of tinned cans, it is no longer necessary for a man who wishes to dine, as distinguished from a mere feeding animal, to furtively seek some restaurant of remote Soho, jealously guarding its secret from its fellows. But Mr. Pringle, in his favorite study of human nature, was an occasional visitor of the Poissonniere in Gerald Street, and the better to peruse his researches had he always denied familiarity with the foreign tongues he heard around him. The restaurant was distinctly close. Indeed, some might have called it stuffy, and Pringle, through a near ventilator, thoughtfully provided by the management, was fast being dulled into drowsiness, when a man who had taken his seat with a companion at the next table leaned across the intervening gulf and addressed him. "N'osez-vous déranger pas, monsieur?" Pringle, with a smile fatuous, uncomprehending, bowed, but said never a word. "Cochon d'English. Never-vous pas?" "I'm afraid I don't understand," returned Pringle, shaking his head helplessly, but still smiling. "Kanye, fatigue qu'on vous fait très la niaise," persisted the Frenchman, and apparently still skeptical of Pringle's assurance, he waited threats to abuse. "I've known the English gentleman a long time, and without a doubt he does not understand French," testified the waiter, who had now come forward for orders. Satisfied by the corroboration of Pringle's innocence, the Frenchman bowed and smiled sweetly to him, and ordered a bottle of Classe de Vannegut, commenced an earnest conversation with his neighbor. By the time this little incident had closed, Pringle's drowsiness had given place to an intense feeling of curiosity. For what purpose could the Frenchman have been so insistent in disbelieving his expression of ignorance of the language? Why, too, had he striven to make Pringle betray himself by representing insults showered upon him? In a Parisian restaurant, as he knew, far more trivial affronts had ended in meetings of the boards of Bolognese. Besides, cochon was an actionable term in the opera room in France. The Frenchman and his companions had seated themselves at the only vacant table. Also, it was in a corner. Pringle at the next was a single person within earshot, and the Frenchman's extraordinary behavior could only be due to consuming thirst for privacy. Settling himself in an easy position, Pringle closed his eyes, and while appearing to resume his slumber, strained every nerve to discern the slightest word that passed at the next table. Dressed by the choicest mode of Piccadilly, the Frenchman bore himself with all the intolerable self-consciousness of a boulevardier. But there was no trace of good-natured levity in his dark aquiline figures, and his evil glint of the eyes recalled visions of the operatic Mephistopheles. His guest was unmistakably an Englishman of a bank clerk type, who contributed his share of the conversation with halting Anglo-French, punctuated by nervous laughter as, with agonizing pains, he dredged his memory for elusive colloquialisms. Freely translated, this is what Pringle heard. "So your people have really decided to take up the submarine after all?" "Yes, I'm working on the details and some drawings in small scale." "But are they from headquarters?" "Certainly. Duly initialed and passed by the chief constructor." "And you are making?" "Full working drawings." "There'll be no code or other secret about them?" What I am doing can be understood by any naval architect. Ah, an English one. The measurements, of course, are English, but they're easily convertible. You could do that? Too dangerous. Suppose a copy of the metric scale were to be found in my possession. Besides, the draftsman could reduce them in an hour or two. And when can you let me have it? In about 2 weeks. Impossible. I shall not be here. Unless something happens to let me get on with it quickly, I don't see how I can do it even then. I'm never sufficiently free from interruption to take tracings. There are far too many eyes upon me. The only chance I have is to spoil the thing as soon as I have the salient points worked out on it, and after I have pretended to destroy it, smuggle it home. Then I shall have to take elaborate notes every day and work out the details from them in the evening. It's simply impossible for me to attempt to make a finished drawing out of the yard, and as it is, I don't quite see a way of getting the spoilt one out. They look so sharply after spoilt drawings. 2 weeks, you say, then? Yes, and I shall have to sit up most nights copying the day's work for my notes to do it. Listen. In a week I must attend the Ministry of Marine in Paris, but our military attaché is my friend. I can trust him. He shall come down to you. What? Chatham? Do you wish to ruin me? Smile from the Frenchman. No, it must be London, where no one knows me. Admirable. My friend will be better able to meet you. Very well. As soon as I am ready, I will telegraph to you. Might not the address of the embassy be remarked by telegraph officials? Your English post office is charmingly unsuspicious, but we must not risk everything. Perhaps so. Well, I will come up to London and telegraph you from there. But your representative, will he be prepared for it? I will warn him to expect it in 14 days. He made an entry in his pocketbook. How will you sign the message? Gustav Zede, suggested the Englishman, snickering for the first and only time. Too suggestive. Sign yourself Pauline, and simply add the time. Pauline, then. Where shall the rendezvous be? At the most public place we can find. Public? Certainly. Some place where everyone will be too much occupied with his own affairs to notice you. What say you to your Nelson's column? There you can wait at the way we shall agree upon. It would be difficult for me to disguise. It would be difficult thing for me to wear a disguise. All disguises are clumsy unless one is an expert. Listen, you shall be gazing at the statue with one hand to your breast, so. Yes, I might hold a Baedeker in my other hand. Oh, admirable, my friend. You have a true spirit of an artist, sneered the Frenchman. Your representative will advance and say to me, Pauline, and the exchange can be made without another word. Exchange. I presume your government is prepared to pay me handsomely for the very heavy risks I am running in the matter, said the Englishman stuffily. Oh, pardon, my friend. How imbecile of me. I authorized to offer you 10,000 francs. A pause, during which the Englishman made a calculation on the back of an envelope. That is 400 pounds, he remarked, tearing the envelope into carefully minute fragments. Far too little for such a risk. Permit me to remind you, my friend, that you came in search of me, or rather of those I represent. You have something to sell? Good, but it is customary for the merchant to display his wares first. I pledge myself to give you copies of the working drawings made for the use of the artificers themselves. I've already met you oftener than is prudent. As I say, you will offer too little. Should the drawings prove useless to us, we should, of course, return them to your Admiralty, explaining how they came into our possession. There was an unpleasant smile beneath the Frenchman's waxed mustache as he spoke. What sum do you ask? 500 pounds in small notes, say £5 each. That is, what do you say? 12,500 francs. Impossible. My limit is 12,000. So the Englishman at length gave an ungracious consent, and after some adroit compliments, beneath which the other sought to bury his implied threat, the pair rose from the table. Either by accident or by design, the Frenchman stumbled over the feet of Pringle, who, with his long legs stretched out from under the table, his head bowed and his lips parted, appeared to be in profound slumber. Opening his eyes slightly, he feigned a lifelike yawn and stretched his arms and gazed lazily around, to the entire satisfaction of the Frenchman, who, in the act of parting his companion, he watched him from the door. Calling for some coffee, Pringle lighted a cigarette and reflected with a glow the indignant patriotism upon the sordid transaction he had become privy to. It is seldom that public servants are in this country found to betray their trust, with all honor to be recorded of them. But there ever exists the possibility of some underpaid official succumbing to the temptation, at the command of the less scrupulous representatives of foreign powers, whose actions in this respect are always ignored officially by their superiors. To Pringle's somewhat cynical imagination, the sordid huckstering of a dockyard draughtsman with a French naval attaché appealed as corroboration of Walpole's famous principle, and as he walked home to the Furnol's Inn, and seat of his fictitious literary agency, he determined, if possible, to turn his discovery to the mutual advantage of his country and to himself, especially the later. During the next few days, Pringle elaborated a plan of taking up the residence of Chatham, only to reject it as he had done so many previous ones. Indeed, so many difficulties presented themselves to every single course of action, that the 10th day after found him strolling down Bond Street in the morning without having taken any further step in the matter. With his characteristic fastidious neatness in personal matters, he was bound for the Piccadilly establishment of the Chief, and for West Enders, the only firm of hatters in London. "Britton Street, do you know?" said a voice suddenly. And Pringle turned around and found himself accosted by a swarthy foreigner. "Bruton Street, n'est-ce pas?" Pringle suggested. "Marseille, Bourrin Street, monsieur," was the reply in a faint echo of the English syllables. "Ah, le voir, à droite," was Pringle's glib direction, politely raising his hat in the response to the other's salute. He was about to resume his walk when he noticed that the Frenchman had been joined by a companion, who appeared to have been making similar inquiries. The latter started, uttering a slight exclamation on meeting Pringle's eye. The recognition was mutual. It was a French attaché. He hurried down Bond Street, and Pringle raised the acutest annoyance that this deception at the restaurant had been unavailing, while he must now abandon all hope of a counterplot for the honor of country, and to say nothing of his own profit. The port wine mark on his cheek was far too conspicuous for the attaché not to recognize him by, and regretted soon his neglect to remove it as soon as he had decided to follow up on the affair. Forgetful of all beside, he walked on to Piccadilly, and it was not until he found himself more than half-way back in the chambers that he remembered the purpose for which he had gone to set out. But matters of greater importance now claimed his attention. It was endeavored by brisk exercise to work off some of the chagrin with which he had consumed. Only as he reached the inn and turned into the gateway did it occur to him that he had been scrupulously careless in thus going straight homeward. What if he had been followed? Never in his life had he shown such disregard in ordinary precautions. Glancing back, he just caught a glimpse of a figure which seemed to whip behind the corner of the gateway. He retraced his steps and looked out at Holborn. There, in a very active retreat, but still a few feet away from the gate, was the attaché himself. Cursing the persistence of his own folly, Pringle dived through the arch again, and determined that the Frenchman should discover no more that day. He turned. Cursing the persistence of his own folly, Pringle dived through the arch again, and determined that the Frenchman should discover no more that day. He turned nimbly to the left and ran up his own stairway before the pursuer could have time to re-enter the inn. The most galling reflection of this absolute importance was in the matter. Through lack of the most elementary foresight, he had been fairly run to earth, and could see no way of ridding himself of this unwelcome attention. To transfer his domicile, to tear himself up by the roots, as it were, was out of the question. And as he glanced around him, the soft carpets, the luxurious chairs, the warm, distempered walls with their old prints above the daffodil of dwarf bookcases, he felt that pang of severance from the refined associations of his chambers would be too acute. Besides, he would inevitably be tracked elsewhere. He would gain nothing by the transfer. One thing at least was absolutely certain. The trouble which the Frenchman was taking to watch him showed the importance he attached to the Pringle's discovery. But this again only increased his disgust with the ill luck which had met him at the very outset. After all, he had done nothing illegal, however contrary it might be to the code of ethics, so that if it pleased them, the entire French legation might continue to watch him till day of judgment, and consoling himself with this reflection, has philosophically dismissed this matter from his mind. It was nearing 6 when he again left the inn for Beguine's, the great Poland Street restaurant, which he much affected. Instead of proceeding due west, he crossed Holborn, intending to bound near the way of the Strand and Regent Street, and so get up an appetite. The Staple Inn he paused a moment in further archway. The little square, always reposeful amid the stress and turmoil of its environment, seemed doubly so this evening, and its 18th-century calm was welcome after the raucous thoroughfare. An approaching football echoed noiselessly, and Pringle moved from the shadow of the narrow wall. The newcomer hesitated and stopped, then made the circuit of the square, scanning the doorways as if in search of a name. The action was not unnatural, hence 24 hours earlier Pringle would have thought nothing of it, but after the event of the morning he endowed it with a personal interest, and walking on, ascended the steps of the Southampton buildings and stopped by a hoarding. As he looked back, he was rewarded by the sight of a man stealthily emerging from the archway and making his way up the steps, only to halt as he suddenly came abreast of Pringle. Although his face was unfamiliar, Pringle could only conclude that the man was following him, and all doubt was removed when, having walked along the street and turning about at the entrance of Chancery Lane, he saw the spy had resumed chase, and was now a few yards back. Pringle, as a philosopher, felt more inclined to laughter than resentment at this ludicrous espionage. In a spirit of mischief, he pursued his way to the Strand at a tortoise-like crawl, halting as if doubtful of his way at every corner, and staring into every shop whose lights still invited customers. Once or twice he even doubled back, and passing quite close to the man, had several opportunities of examining him. He was quite unobtrusive, even respectable-looking. There was nothing of the foreigner about him, and Pringle shrewdly conjectured that the attaché, wearied of sentry-go, had turned it over to some English servant on whom he could rely. Thus shepherded, Pringle arrived at the restaurant, from which he only emerged after a stray maliciously prolonged over each item of the menu, followed by a smoking of no fewer than 3 cigars of a brand specially lauded by the proprietor. With a measure of humanity deluding his malice, he was about to offer the infallibly exhausted sentinel some refreshment, when he came out, but as a man was invisible. Pringle started for home, taking much of the same route as before, and calmly debating whether or no the cigars he had just sampled would be a wise investment. Nor until he had reached Southampton Buildings, and the sight of the hoarding recalled the spy's discomfiture, did he think of looking back to see if he were still followed. All but the main thoroughfares were by this time deserted, and although he shot a keen glance up and down Chancery Lane, now clear of all but the most casual traffic, not a soul was anywhere near him. By a curious philosophical progress, Pringle felt inclined to resent the man's absence. He had begun to regard him almost in the light of a bodyguard, the private escort of some eminent politician. Besides, the whole incident was pregnant with possibilities appealing to his keenly intellectual sense of humor, and as he passed the hoarding, he peered into its shadow with the half-admitted hope that his attendant might be lurking in its depths. Later on he recalled how, as he glanced upwards, a man's figure passed like a shadow from the ladder to an upper platform of the scaffold. The vision, fleeting and unsubstantial, had gone almost before his retina had received it, but the momentary halt was to prove his salvation. Even if he had turned to walk on, the cataract of planks amid scaffolding poles and chaos of loose bricks crashed on the spot where he was about to traverse. A stray beam, more erratic in its descent, caught his hat, and telescoping it, glanced off his shoulder, bearing him to the ground, where he lay dazed by a sudden uproar of half choked by the cloud of dust. Rapid and disconcerting as was the event, I remembered afterwards the dim and spectacle shape approaching through the gloom. In a dreamy kind of way he connected it with the other shadow figure he had seen high up on the scaffold, and as it bent over him, recognizing him now as the familiar features of the spy. But other figures replaced the first, and when helped to his feet, he made furtive search amid the circle of faces gathered round him. He had judged it as a hallucination. By the time he had undergone a tentative dust-down, he was sufficiently collected to acknowledge the sympathetic congratulations of the crowd, and to decline a homeward escort of a constable. In the privacy of his chambers, his ideas began to clarify. Events arranged themselves in logical sequence, and the spectres assumed more tangible form. And a single question dwarfed all others. He asked himself, was the cataclysm such an accident as it appeared? And as he surveyed the battered ruins of his hat, he began to realize how nearly it had been the victim of a murderous vendetta. When he arose the next morning, he scarcely needed the dilapidated hat to remind himself of the events of yesterday. Normally a sound of a dreamless sleeper, his rest had been a series of short snatches of slumber interposed between long spells of rumination. While he marveled at the intensity of malice which he could no longer doubt pursued him, a vindictiveness more natural to a medieval Italian state than to the present-day metropolis, he bitterly regretted the fatal curiosity which had brought him to such an extremity. By no means deficient in the grosser terms of physical courage, his sense that the game which was being played, his adversaries, as unscrupulous as they were crafty, held all the cards, and above all that their espionage effectively prevented him from filling in the gaps of the plot, of which he had yet only half discovered, and was especially galling to this active and somewhat neurotic temperament. Until yesterday he had almost decided to drop the affair of the restaurant Passanier, and now, after what he firmly believed to be a deliberate attempt to assassinate him, he realized the desperate situation of a duelist with his back to the wall. Having scarce room to parry, he felt the prick of his antagonist's rapier deliberately goading him as an innocuous thrust. Was he regarded as the possessor of a dangerous secret? Then it behoved him to strike, and with that, without delay. Now that he was about to attack, a disguise was essential, and reflecting how lamentably he had failed through the absence of one hitherto, he removed the port wine mark from his right cheek with the customary spirit lotion, and blackened his fair hair with a few smart applications of preparation from his bureau. It was with a determination to shun any obscure streets or alleys, and especially all buildings of course of erection, that he started out after his usual light breakfast. At first he was doubtful whether he was being followed or not, but after a few experimental turns and doublings he was unable to single out any regular attendant of his walk. Either his disguise had proved effectual, or his enemies imagined that the attempt of last night had been less innocent in its results. Somewhat soothed by that discovery, Pringle had gravitated towards the Strand, and nearing Charing Cross, when he observed a man cross from the station to the opposite corner, carrying a brown roll of paper. With his thoughts running in one direction, Pringle in a flash recognized the dockyard draughtsman. Could he even now be on his way to deliver and keep the appointment at Nelson's column? He had been warned of Pringle's discovery, and so expedited his treacherous task. And thus reflecting, Pringle determined at all hazards to follow him. The draughtsman made straight for the telegraph office. It was now the busiest time of the morning, and most of the little desks were occupied by more or less glib message riders. And the draughtsman had found a single vacancy at the far end when Pringle followed him in and reached over his shoulder to withdraw a form from the rack in front of him. Grabbing 3 or 4, Pringle neatly spilled them upon the desk, and with the abject apology hastily gathered them up with the form from the draughtsman was employed upon. More apologies, and Pringle, seizing a suddenly vacant desk, affected to compose a telegram of his own. The draughtsman message had been short, and, to Pringle, exceptionally sweet, consisting as it did the three words, 43, Pauline. The address Pringle had not attempted to read. He knew that already. The moment the other left, Pringle took up a sheaf of forms, and, as it had been the sole reason of his visit, hurried out of the Here his first care was to fold some newspapers into a brown paper parcel resembling the one carried by the draughtsman, as nearly as he could remember it. And having cut a number of squares of stiff tissue paper, he stuffed the envelope with them and pondered over a cigarette, the most difficult stage of the campaign. Twice had the draughtsman seen him, once at the restaurant in his official guise as the sham literary agent, with fair, smooth face, fair hair, and fugitive port wine mark staining his right cheek. Again that morning with blackened hair and unblemished face. True, he might have forgotten the stranger at the restaurant, but on the other hand he might not, and Pringle was then, as always, steadfastly averse to leaving anything to chance. Perhaps in view of the sudden journey to London, it was very likely that he had received warning of Pringle's discovery. Lastly, it was more than probable that the spy was still on duty, even though he had failed to recognize Pringle that morning. The matter was cinched by a single glance at the Venetian mirror above the mantel, which reflected a feature he had overlooked, his now blackened hair. Nothing remained for him to assume the disguise which should impose both the spy and the draughtsman, and after some thought he decided to make up as a Frenchman of the South, and to pose as a servant of the French embassy. Reminiscent of the immortal Tartarin, his ready bureau fashioned him with a stiff black mustache and some especially stout horsehair, typically of the stubbly beard of a hero. When, at almost 4:15, he descended into the inn with the parcel in hand. The Baedeker and the envelope was tissues in his pocket. A cab was just setting down, and impulsively he chartered it as far as Exeter Hall. Concealed in the cab, he imagined he would be more readily escape the observation, and by the time he alighted, flattering himself that he had pursued had been baffled. As he discharged the cab, however, he noticed the hansom draw up a few paces to the rear, whilst a man got out and began to saunter westward behind him. Suspicions alert, although the man was certainly a stranger, Pringle at once put him into the rest to the test by entering Romano's and ordering a small whiskey. After a decent delay, he emerged, and his pulse quickened when he saw the couple of doors of the same man staring in the shop window. Pringle walked a few yards back and then crossed the opposite side of the street, but altogether he dodged the infinite peril through the string of omnibuses, and was able to shake off his satellite, who, with unswerving persistence, occupied the most limited horizon whenever he looked back. For almost the first time in his life, Pringle began to despair. That complacent regard of his own precautions had proved but a fool's paradise. Despite his elaborate disguise, he must have been plainly recognizable to his enemies, and he began to ask himself whether it was not useless to struggle further. As he paced slowly on, an indefinable depression stole over him. He thought of the heavy price so nearly exacted for his intervention. Resentment surged over him at the memory, and his hand clenched on the parcel. The contact furnished the very stimulus he required. The instrument of settling such a score was in his hands, and rejecting his tremendous doubts, he strode on, determined to make one bold and final stroke in the vengeance. The shadows had lengthened appreciably, and the quarter chiming in the near St. Martin's warned him that there was no time to lose. The spy must be got rid of at any cost. Already he could see the estuary of the stand, and the square widening beyond, and at his right loomed the tunnel of the Lother Arcade, with its vista of juvenile delights. The sight of it was inspiring. Darting in, he turned off the sharp to the left of the artist's repository, with a double entrance to the stand and arcade, and softly closing the door, peeped through the pallets and frames which hung upon the glass. Hardly had they ceased swinging to his movement when, at the satisfaction of seeing the spy, the scent was already cold, rushed feverishly up the arcade, and of course marking his fallen toys as the cries of outraged stall-keepers. Turning, Pringle made a purchase of a sketching block, and first thing handy, he then passed through the door and gave on the stand. At the post office he stopped to survey the scene. A single policeman stood by the eastward base of the column, and the people scattered around seemed but ordinary wayfarers, but just across the maze of traffic was a spectacle of intense interest to him. At the quadrant of the Grand Hotel, patrolling aimlessly in front of the shops, at which he seemed too perturbed to stare for more than a few seconds at a time, the draughtsman kept palpitating vigil until the clock should strike the half-hour of his treason. True to the Frenchman's advice, he sought safety in the crowd, avoiding the desert of the square until the last moment. It wanted 2 minutes to the half-hour when Pringle opened his Baedeker, and thrusting one hand into his breast, examined the statue and coil of rope erected to the glory of our greatest hero. "Pauline!" said a musical inflection attained by any but a Frenchman. Beside him stood a slight, neatly dressed young man, with close-cropped hair and a mustache and imperial, who cast a significant look at the parcel. Pringle immediately held it towards him. The dark gentleman produced an envelope from his breast pocket. The exchange was effected in silence. With bows and raising of hats they parted, while Big Ben boomed on his 8 bells. The attaché representative had disappeared some minutes beyond the westernmost line before the draughtsman appeared from the opposite direction, his uncertain steps intermitted by frequent halts and nervous backward glances. With his back to the National Gallery, he reduced the Baedeker and commenced to stare up at the monument, withdrawing his hands every now and then to cast a shamefaced look to the right and left. In his agitation, the draughtsman had omitted his hand-on-the-breast attitude, and even as Pringle advanced to his side, he murmured Pauline. His legs, almost stronger than his will, seemed to be urging him to a flight from the field of dishonor. With tremendous eagerness, he thrust the brown paper parcel into Pringle's hands, and snatching the envelope with tissue slips, rushed across the road and disappeared into the bar of the Grand Hotel. Pringle turned to go, but was confronted by a revolver, and as his eye traversed the barrel and met that of its owner, he recognized the Frenchman to whom he had just sold the bundle of newspapers. Dodging the weapon, he tried to spring into the open, but the restraining grip on each elbow held him to the angle of plinth, and turning over the little Pringle, found himself in the custody of a man who had last been seen in full cry-up of the Lother Arcade. No constable was anywhere near, and even casual passers walked unheeded by the nook. So quiet is the progress of this little drama. Lowering his revolver, the dark gentleman picked up the parcel which had fallen from Pringle in struggle. He opened it with delicacy and withdrew some sheets of tracing paper, which he examined, and then placed the whole in his inner pocket. Giving a sign to the spy to loose his grip, he spoke for the first time. "May I suggest, sir," he said in excellent English with the slightest foreign accent, "may I suggest that in the future you do not meddle with what you cannot possibly concern you. These documents have been bought and sold, and although you have good enough to act as an intermediary in the transaction, I can assure you we were under no suspicion of calling on you for your help." Here in his hard tone, and speaking in less calmness, the accents became more noticeable. "I discovered your impertinence in selling me a parcel of worthless papers very shortly after I left you. Had you succeeded in the attempt you appear to have planned so carefully, it is possible you might have lived long enough to regret it. Perhaps not. I wish you a good day, sir." He bowed and turned to his companion, and Pringle, walking on, turned up by the corner of the Union Club. Dunn's clock marked 20 minutes to 5, and Pringle reflected on how much had been compressed into the last quarter of an hour. True, he had not prevented the sale of his country's secrets. On the other hand, he pressed the pocket which held the envelope of notes. Hailing a cab, he was about to step in, when, looking back at the nook between the lines, he saw confused movements upon the spot. The two men who had just left were struggling with a third, who, brandishing a full handful of something white, was endeavoring, with varying success, to plant his fist on the divers' areas of the persons. This was a draughtsman. A small crowd which momentarily increased surrounded them, and Pringle climbed into the hansom. The two policemen were able to penetrate and ring, and apparently lay hands upon all three combatants.